I'm going to only speak for a minute or so and then really turn it over to Ryan. This is really a follow-up to the campus budget presentation that we had, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. And the reason we decided to do two separate presentations was to really make the point that the building, the creating of the FY18 budget, which all of you are aware we are doing right now, is being built under the outcomes-based funding model and all of the requirements of that. What we're talking about today is the development of the unified budget or the unified funding model or the unified budget build model, whatever the term is, which is going to kick in for the building and creating of the FY19 budget. It will be different, and the reason we wanted to do two separate presentations was to make it clear to everybody that we're going from one system to another system, and I think there was some confusion on the part of everybody, I'd say, about what this really means, that we're ending one system and moving to another system. The good news is we are ending outcomes-based funding, and more on that later. But Ryan is going to present this model, and I do want to make the point that he will get to the point of covering the recommendations that were generated. And there's about 29 recommendations. Some of them will get more attention today than others. The one point I want to make is this work was done by a lot of people. There were people from every campus involved in this, and these recommendations that come forward are really a collective effort, certainly led by Ryan. And the other thing is I want to make the point that there are a couple of them that we'll talk about in greater detail, and it has to do with tuition and fee money. Where is that? What happens to that revenue as we move into this new model? What do we do in terms of reviewing a new allocation model? And that's something that will be built in, a review every several years so it could be adjusted and not locked in place. Our current historical allocation, which preceded outcomes-based funding, was developed, set in place when the University of Maine system was formed and was not touched for, 40 years? We're not going to do that again. And I'll speak briefly about what do we do about private fundraising. And the bottom line is funds raised privately by this campus or any other campus remain with the campus, period. And then there'll be a discussion about carry forward and reserves and how that will be handled going forward into this new budgeting model. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. If you remember, Ryan's had a long history working at the state. He worked in the governor's office. He was the commissioner of finance. He came to the University of Maine system. Then he came to the University of Maine as our CFO. And then he stepped into a role as the University of Maine system CFO. And that's the position he occupies now. So anyway, he's a great partner to work with, and I'll let him talk.
Big thanks to the president for inviting me here today. I look forward to talking about where we are in the process. We've been doing this work. We started, close to 18 months ago, and I've actually really enjoyed getting out and having the chance to talk about, the process all the way from our very first listening session right through today, and the work we anticipate over the next 6 months. We have had. I think we figured about 85 hours worth of public conversations about the unified budget and about the recommendations as we worked our way through this. I will say that is, we're going to continue that same level of kind of transparency through this next phase as well. Today I'm going to try to mostly focus on the process, what we're going to be doing from today going forward. So again, although the Board of Trustees endorsed 29 recommendations recently in Fort Kent, we are not going to simply just plow forward with those and let you know how they all come out next July. We are going to go through a process for each one of those. We're developing implementation plans for each of the 29 initiatives. So as you imagine, some of them are pretty simple. There's a handful of recommendations in here where we can just move forward based on the endorsement of the board. There are other ones. The funding model is a perfect example that are going to require a lot more work, a lot more input from the campus communities. Again, look forward to getting out and talking about those. Look forward to ideally being, taking advantage of forums like this, provost council, faculty senates, anywhere where, two people, where anyone is looking, wants to talk about the unified budget recommendations, we continue to be happy to have those conversations. Again, the biggest focus today is going to be on the funding model. That's the one where we're going to definitely be looking for the most input and feedback from the campus. But it will touch on some of the other ones as well. I want to briefly go back and just, for folks that haven't followed this as closely, I'll just talk a little bit quickly about the process that we've put in place for the unified budget. We started this in July of 2015. The CBOs worked with the President's Council, spent a lot of work between July and October, really figuring out how do we do this? So the only direction we got was, create a unified budget, and no real direction other than that. So we spent a lot of time figuring out a plan, organizing ourselves. We started creating sub-teams in November of last year. We put together charters, work plans that we followed for each of the kind of 5 subgroups that we put together at that time. And then throughout the plan, we just did a ton of campus visits. Did at least 5 or 6 forums at every campus. Spent a lot of time gathering feedback. All of that feedback that we received along the way, and then on the final recommendations, all of those comments that we got back, all of that information is posted online. We use that as we eventually finalized the recommendations. We developed recommendations. It ultimately ended up being in 5 key areas back in January. And then what we did was we took those recommendations out and asked folks to react to those recommendations. We held an open comment period. Again, we've got pages and pages and pages of feedback during that window. We closed it in July, and then we pulled our team together and literally went through all of those comments and made a number of changes to our original recommendations based on that feedback we got. So very appreciative of folks' involvement in that. We took that final set of recommendations to the trustees in July. We took additional feedback between the July and September window, and then ultimately at the September 18-19 meeting up in Fort Kent, the trustees approved the 29 recommendations. We are now finally in that last stage of our work, so implementing the recommendations. Most, 28 I guess, of the recommendations will take effect at the beginning of fiscal year 18. The one exception to that is the funding model. Because it is fairly complex, and we'll spend a little bit of time walking through it. But in order for us to implement that in FY18, we would have had that model done a long time ago. I mean, that's the budget that we're all building right now. So for the unified, or for the funding model, that will kick in fiscal year 19. So when we're sitting here next year having conversations, you'll all be telling me how much you love the new funding model. So look forward to that. So again, I'm not going to focus on every one of these recommendations, but as I said, we're going to be developing an implementation plan for each of the 29 recommendations that were approved. We will again post that information so folks can see what the plans are for that. I will just touch on a few of these as I work my way through and eventually get to the funding model where I spend most of the time. I certainly invite President Hunter to jump in on any of these. We tried to focus, the ones we'll pull out are the ones that the president had emphasized, the ones that certainly impact this campus. When I do this presentation at other campuses, I expect they'll want to emphasize maybe different recommendations. One of the ones that we spent a lot of time focused on was our tuition rate pricing structure. No rhyme or reason to the tuition rates that we have across the system. Spent a lot of time talking about this on the road, at least 14 different directions that we go in. Again, no real plan for that. Usually it's just been increasing 2-3% a year. And so one of the things we wanted to do was put together a rate pricing structure that we thought made sense. And so we ultimately recommended a 3-tiered structure. I haven't come up with a better word for tier yet. I know people, certainly at other campuses, hate that because they assume if you're not in tier 1, that must be a quality issue. I'll use tier here because you're in tier 1. I'll try to come up with another word by the time I do this one in Machias next week. But what we did, we had the University of Maine at a tier, in a tier by itself. We were not recommending that this campus base its pricing decisions on what USM is doing or what Farmington is doing. Completely different peers, a completely different model here. So one of the first things that we did was we established the University of Maine in a tier by itself. We have a second tier of the University of Maine at Farmington and the University of Southern Maine, and then a third tier of the 4 remaining campuses, Machias, Presque Isle, Fort Kent, and Augusta. And so again, the idea was that within those tiers, the pricing would be similar. So what those campuses will do is sometime between over a 1 to 3 year period, they'll slowly start adjusting their tuition up so that they arrive at that next level. So a good example is USM. They're $8 a credit hour below where Farmington is. They are not going to do that all in 1 year because we've had conversations. We will have conversations over the next several months about the potential for a tuition increase. If we have a traditional tuition increase and then on top of that you throw on another $8 a credit hour, then we're out there talking about 6 and 7% tuition increases, and that's not why we did this work, so that we could go back to enormous tuition increases year over year. So what you'll see at a campus like what USM is doing, they're going to make that $8 up over 3 years, and so instead of the 2.6% tuition increase that we're having conversations about, it would be something closer to 3.5. Other campuses will implement, according to their own. If we have some of the smaller campuses that really don't have to move up $1 or $2, they may do it all in in 1 year. But we've given campuses that flexibility. On the out-of-state side, we had talked about also grouping campuses as part of that. Ultimately, we chose not to. I think the UMaine example is a perfect one. Each of the campuses has different kind of out-of-state competitors, out-of-state peers. We wanted to be able to put the campus, the experts at the campus level, to be able to put together plans for out-of-state tuition based on the markets that they're trying to hit. So again, we left that up to the campuses. A couple more. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the unified rate structure or the collaborative degree programs, other than to say this is one where we've had some. We didn't have a VCAA for a long time. It would have been ideal to have a VCAA for part of these conversations. But what the goal of these recommendations is not to go to Jeff and say that this collaborative degree program needs to be at this dollar amount. But instead, to work with Bob Neely, to work with the CAOs, to come up with a process, a script almost. We're going to have a collaborative degree. What are the steps we want to do? We may not arrive at the same rate, but if we follow the same process, I think that's what we're looking to do. That's in line, I think, where the conversations that the Vice Chancellor is having, and so we'll look to work with his team and Jeff and his counterparts as we move forward with those recommendations. You'll see other recommendations in this section, a lot of them around fees. Again, looking for a little bit more consistency. Does not mean one size fits all, but when we have 5 different add drop dates across the system, those kind of things, looking for opportunities where without impacting the way a campus operates, if there's opportunities where we can make changes that benefits the student, then that's certainly something we want to look at. We spent a lot of time focused in on the state allocation model. Actually, let me just go back. We did make recommendation 1. We did make some base budget adjustments to a couple of campuses. We used administrative review savings to make those adjustments. We had a couple of campuses. I think Fort Kent is a perfect example where Fort Kent, at least compared to Presque Isle, very similar mission, very similar student populations, but $1.5 million difference in their state appropriation. On a campus that size, that's a huge difference. So we made a couple of adjustments to base budgets. With those adjustments comes the kind of accountability that I certainly heard in a lot of our public discussions, kind of the frustration that we have 3, 4, 5 campuses, and it rotates which ones they are, that consistently had challenges balancing their budget. So the trustees agreed to make these adjustments, but part of that means that those campuses need to come in this year with balanced budgets. So Machias, Presque Isle, Fort Kent, working with them with these campus-based budget adjustments so that they'll come in this year with a balanced budget and not $1 million, $1.5 million short, which has pretty much been the trend over the last several years. We are going to spend, again, most of the time talking about the new funding model, so I'll skip right over that. Really wanted to emphasize recommendation 4, which really goes to the point that President Hunter made, is that the goal is not to go another 50 years before we make adjustments to the current funding formula, to the extent that you can even refer to it as a formula. So one of the things that we've done is that, starting fiscal year 21, that'll be 2 years after the new model is in effect. We will review that at least every 3 years, if not sooner, just to see if it's doing the things that we want. What are the kind of adjustments that we need to make? If missions are changing, that means peers would change. So we are going to build right into the process that we're going to continually review the model and not let it get stale 5 years from now. Again, as the president mentioned, tuition and fee revenue is going to continue to remain at the campus level. Some of you may remember when we first started these conversations, one of the proposals that the trustees asked us to look at was the idea that all tuition and fee revenue across the system would go into this giant bucket. And then we would come up with an allocation model that would send that out to the campuses regardless of where those tuition and fee dollars were earned. I think we were unanimous in our recommendation that that was not a good strategy, that would not be a way to incent credit hour generation. I can't imagine, the same enthusiasm around a flagship match if you were bringing all those students in and then I took the revenue and sent it up to Fort Kent or sent it to USM. So very concerned about that incentive, and so there was strong support for that recommendation. Again, just touch on a few more of these. We're going to look for opportunities around institutional aid and waivers. The things that I really just mentioned here is that we've already reached out to Rosa. We have some conversations lined up. We're going to work with the Enrollment Management Council, the financial aid directors. We're not experts in this area. We're not going to impose recommendations in this. So we're going to work with that team, make sure we look for opportunities where we can see efficiencies, where we can make consistent policies. But again, going to do it in a way that's informed by the expertise at the campus level. As the president mentioned, private funds continue to be raised, that are raised at the campus level will continue to stay there. I think we heard that at every campus we were at, even campuses that don't necessarily raise a lot of funds at the campus level, at least aspire to do that, and when they do, they don't want someone taking it. So strong support for that recommendation as well. And then you see, again, some of the other recommendations. These are all online. There's an incredibly exciting video of me going through each one of these in much more detail than this. And so if you're bored on a Saturday, those videos are out there for you. I'm going to touch on the last few here. Certainly around reserves. There's been a lot of questions about reserves. That was another one where the trustees I think we're inclined to think that reserves, we're a single system in statute, so, like state government, why don't all the reserves come in centrally? And then we figure out how we allocate them back out. We did not endorse that decision. All 7 of the chief business officers strongly supported the idea that reserves that were on a campus should stay on that campus. And so as we transition into this new funding model, as we transition into these other unified budget recommendations, any reserves that exist on a campus as we transition into this new model will stay on that campus. Going forward, there are some small recommendations, small tweaks to that. One of the goals that we had was that we'd like to get to the point where each campus has reserves equivalent to at least 10% of their budget. Again, you look at some of the campuses that we have across the system. You get a day like we've had the last couple of days. You get roof leaks, and they have no resources whatsoever. I mean, literally no resources in some cases. I think in at least 3 campuses, we have no reserves whatsoever. So what happens is they come to the system, or they do nothing. They just let the water flow in through, and then that creates other problems that we need to address down the road. So we'd like to get all of those campuses up to at least 10%. And so one of the things that we're recommending is that once a campus, any funds would stay on a campus, again, going forward. Once campuses get to that 10% level, and again, right now, I think it's just UMA. UMA is actually the only campus that's in this boat right now. Once you're over that threshold, if in a following year you're still above that threshold and you generate a surplus in a fiscal year, 90% of that would stay on a campus. 10% would go into kind of a central pool that then we would allocate out to, likely some of the smaller campuses to get them up to that 10% level. We've also put in some kind of some policies just to make sure that, you might imagine there's a campus at 9.5%, you give them some resources, now they're at 10, they spend it down, you give them more resources, they spend it down. We wanted to prevent ourselves and CEOs from kind of gaming that system, so there are some policy changes in there. But again, the vast majority of campus resources would continue, excess resources would continue to stay at the campus level. Other recommendations you see, the ones around capital project funding, those are the ones that I talk about where we probably don't have to have huge implementation plans. 1-year capital plans into the annual budgeting process. We love that idea so much. We actually did that last year. Worked out very well. We would continue to do that. Love the idea of establishing a capital committee across the system that would review requests, look at prioritizing bond requests. We actually did that this year. President Hunter was a part of that group. So that's another one where we kind of ran a pilot in the facilities area. We were very excited about how those recommendations worked, and we'll continue those on a going forward basis. Take my notes, make sure I don't miss anything. Okay. You want to?
I don't know. You can talk a while and then I'll talk
Okay.
after you're
Yep.
done.
So I'm going to start working my way towards the funding model. I'm not going to walk through every single step. There are multiple steps that I'm not going to talk about today. Again, another exciting 25-minute video of me walking through these steps. If you haven't had a chance to actually look at that, I actually would encourage you to spend the time there, because there are a couple of steps that I won't cover today, but it does give you a good feel about how the model works. But I think the first question is, why do we need a new model? I think most folks here, they may not know all the reasons why, but they know they hate the current one. I think that's universal on most of our campuses across the system. As President Hunter said, for 45 years, we had this historic funding allocation. And again, regardless of whether the legislature gave us $20 or $500 million, Machias was going to get 3% of it, UMPI was going to get 4%, University of Maine was going to get 50%, and so on. Again, no relation whatsoever to enrollment, to mission, all of those things. Again, regardless of what we got, this was how we allocated it out. Heard a lot of concern about that formula, despite the fact, or that allocation model, despite the fact we didn't do anything about it for 45 years. So it actually started in 2012. We put together a group at the trustees' direction, came up with outcomes-based funding. We implemented that starting the first year in 2014. Again, because we weren't getting any new resources, from 2008 to 2016, our state appropriation increased by a total of $1 million. So there were no resources coming in at this time. So what the decision that the trustees endorsed at the time was that we would pull 5% out of that historic allocation and flow that through the outcomes-based funding model. So you can see why, I'll use this campus as an example, and you can see why you might not like it. because when you pull out 5% of a model where you're getting 50% and you replace it with one where you're getting 41, 42, 43%, it's a loss. And so every year you go forward, if there's no state appropriation, we increase outcomes-based funding, you actually lose resources. So I think the experience here has been that every time this goes up by 5%, you lose about $700,000 of your state appropriation. So again, if it's a year when we've been flat funded, which is pretty much where we've been for the last decade, every year you can count on losing $700,000 more of the state appropriation. The recommendation that was endorsed at that time was that we would start at 5% and we would work our way over to 30%, and then we would see where we were. So we are building the FY18 budget right now. We are at 25% of the formula is flowing through outcomes-based funding. It's actually a little bit higher than that because one of the other recommendations that was part of there was that if we ever did get new resources, 100% of those resources would flow through the outcomes-based funding model. So that's the 16, 17, and the 18 amounts that you see up at the top. Those were new dollars that we finally received. All of those flowed through that model. So it actually increased what would have been, an increase had we been with the historic formula. We had a long conversation with the CBOs about. I think we were unanimous in the fact that nobody liked outcomes-based funding. Even the campuses that were winners in outcomes-based funding didn't like it. But the folks at Augusta made a very strong case that despite the fact that they were a net winner in this, they felt that it disincented all of the collaboration, all of those 2+2 agreements, all of those things where you start off a student, then they go somewhere else and graduate. So again, even those folks that made out didn't particularly care for it. We could have phased it out completely here, but we had a very long discussion. This was probably the most heated discussion, I guess, if you will, that we had during this process was whether we stop at 25 or whether we go to 30. There were a few campuses that, again, do very, very well, had built into their 5-year forecast, their 5-year financial forecast, what that increase would mean for their bottom line, just like Claire had built in a loss. And so ultimately, we reached agreement that we would go to the full 30% that the board requested, but then once we get to 30%, we're out. So then we would essentially repeal outcomes-based funding, and it goes away, and then we start with a new funding model in fiscal year 19. Anything you want to add before we jump to
Yeah, I mean, and everybody can hear me, right? Yeah, you can hear me. I can't do a better job on outcomes-based funding except to say I am delighted with its demise. Because clearly, every year we were seeing a substantial reduction in our appropriation. The historic allocation wasn't a good way to go about it either. I mean, if you look at the allocations to the 3 smallest campuses based on per student, they varied widely. Even though those 3 campuses, when it comes to scale and scope, you might look at them and figure that there should be some uniformity. So the historic model wasn't a good one either. We moved to outcomes-based funding, and I'll just say it. Brian may not want to be this blunt, but outcomes-based funding was introduced, developed at the behest of the Board of Trustees because they wanted to reallocate the state appropriation. They wanted more money going to the smaller campuses, period. And so that model really focused on the generation, mostly of undergraduate student credit hours. And so that's why, if you do the math, the University of Maine cannot win under the current outcomes-based funding formula. Moving into this next formula will allow us, and I'll just say one or two more things. It actually will allow us to factor in research and outreach. I mean, if I say to this group of people that it's very expensive to run a land-grant public research university, everybody gets it. But outcomes-based funding didn't recognize that. So when you look at the cost of research, the cost of faculty in very specialized subdisciplines, startup money, match money for grants, the kind of outreach we do. Outreach is not the public service that everybody does on every campus. outreach here is, it is cooperative extension, but it's beyond that. It's faculty that have very, a dedicated portion of their appointment is to work with a commodity group, to work with forestry, to work with the marine industry, to work with engineering concerns. I mean, this is a piece of their job, and that is not accounted for in outcomes-based funding at all. And so moving into this new formula will allow those expenditures to be factored in as the appropriation decision is made, as you know, we churn the numbers. And so I'm ecstatic that we're ending outcomes-based funding. I can't say it any better than that.
So I'm going to transition over to talk about the funding model that we're working on. The slides that you're going to see are still based on, if you've been to these presentations before, they are the same slides. They're still, what you'll see in here is still based on the language that was used in South Carolina, where we stole some of the ideas from this, or at least the big cost drivers. We'll figure out the implementation specific to this system. So I guess I just ask, you'll see the big cost centers. I wouldn't pay as much attention to the details. That's the work that we're going to do going forward. On this new model, again, we put together a team of the CBOs. Claire will be part of that group. And this is the work that we'll do over the next several months, figuring out, we agree that this is a cost center. We want this in the model, but what's the weight that we want to apply to that? Those are the kind of conversations that we'll be working on, and then we'll be coming back out and asking folks for feedback on. I got to follow my notes here, or I'll miss something. So again, the goal that we were looking to do was to identify those big cost centers that take place across each of our campus. Not suggesting that, what do we got here? 6 of them. Not suggesting these are the only 6, but we felt like these were the ones that could really drive a model that really is attempting to recognize the actual costs that are occurring. The goal with all of these metrics and the weights that we assign to them is ultimately end up with a number that says, based on the mission and the size of this particular campus, and this would apply to all 7, this is what we think the budget should be for a campus of this size. And again, that's just recognizing that we don't have 7 equal campuses with 7 completely exact missions. And so we're going to look at, I'll look at each one of these, but one of the things I wanted to note is that what we're ultimately looking to do with this data is not, I just want to be very clear about this, is while what we want to be able to do is develop a number for instruction, a number for student services, and have all these add up to an adequate number for a campus to fulfill its mission. At the end of the day, what we're not planning to do with that data, what is not in our recommendation, is that if we run through the model and it tells us that library services at a particular campus should be $2 million, that continues to be a campus decision. We're using it for purposes of developing the model. We think it makes sense. If the model says that library services on a particular campus should be $2 million, it's a great argument for someone to say they should be getting more resources, but we're not looking for the system to tell the campuses, here's how much you should be spending in these 6 areas. What we're looking to do is to develop a mechanism to distribute about $200 million a year that we get in state appropriation that we currently distribute through a formula created in 1968. So again, I want to emphasize that because at the end, when we get to research and public service, those kind of pieces, we're going to generate numbers. Now, you may spend more or you may spend less on that, but this would be an ideal amount. Then we'll compare that against what the actual state appropriation is, and then work from there. Again, I'll get into that, but wanted to throw that disclaimer out there at the beginning. I'm going to walk through each one of these again, but I wouldn't focus as much on the student services block. You can see we don't have a medical center. I think that's fairly obvious. But again, you can kind of get the flavor of that as I work through this. Most of this will be driven, as you might imagine, by peers. So we'll compare salaries faculty salaries at the University of Maine to a set of University of Maine peers. We're not going to pretend, almost like the current model does, that hiring a faculty member at the University of Maine is the same as hiring a faculty member at UMA. It's just not the case, and we shouldn't have a model that suggests that it is. So again, you get a flavor for how this is going to work. Again, we may not follow exactly these 7 steps, but this is the kind of work that we're doing. We've already reached out we've been working with procurement for the last week or so, putting together an RFP that I think we'll be ready to release sometime next week for a third party to go out and develop. I think we're shooting for between 20 and 25 peers for each of the 7 campuses and for the system. Then we'll use that data again to look for to compare salaries, student-faculty ratios. Again, we may tweak some of these based on the conversations that we have, based on the feedback that we get from all of the campuses. Again, the idea is, how much is it that the University of Maine should be spending in these particular cost areas against what your peers are spending, not what the University of Maine and Fort Kent is spending in these same areas. Again, I mentioned library. I think it's going to be the same for student services. One of the goals that we'd like to do, the numbers would clearly be different in a system of our size. But the idea is just to recognize that there are going to be higher costs at a land grants. I'm sure Joyce has higher costs here than they have at Machias, places like that. So what we've talked about is we want to put together tiers that recognize those costs, so that we also recognize that on the other side, a campus like Machias is going to have a certain amount of costs for library services, whether they have 500 students or whether they have 450, or 2 years from now they have 400. So we want to recognize scale on that side of it, and we also want to recognize that same scale on the flagship side of it as well. So you see, in some cases, tiering down as the number of students goes up. Again, same concept over here on the student service side. In both of these cases, and these are perfect examples where we'd spend a lot of time reaching out to Robert, reaching out to Joyce, their counterparts across the system, coming up with a consistent methodology for determining what these numbers should be across each of our campuses. And that's the work that we'll be doing over the next couple of months. Physical plan facilities. Again, this is an example where we're likely not going to go with a new set of peers. We have a lot of sightlines data that we've been using for a number of years. And so we'll likely keep that, but we'll look for what are those metrics that we want to compare our facilities across the system. We'll build those in. Certainly going to recognize that it's going to cost more to maintain a campus of this size than it might at one of our smaller campuses. Research, public service, certainly have heard concerns about that in relation to the current outcomes-based funding model. Again, these are the metrics that the South Carolina system at least proposed to use. But again, looking at what was the research expenditure in the prior year, multiplying that by some percentage, and then building that as a component into that state appropriation number, again, gives you, just recognizes or builds an incentive in to actually be, you're going to do that kind of research anyway, but this absolutely just builds in an incentive for that, recognizes it in the funding model as well. This will clearly be different. We've got some of these numbers for all 7 campuses. This will be a much bigger focus here at USM than it might be, again, some of our smaller campuses. So this last part will go fairly quickly, and then open it up to questions. But one of the things that we've been asked a lot is, and we thought about a lot as we were putting this model together, was how do you implement it? And that was really the big problem with outcomes-based funding. Even if you thought that funding model was great, and I know where the president stands on that, Even if you thought it was great, we didn't have new resources to implement it, so that created a huge problem. So how do we put together an implementation plan for this model? You might imagine a scenario where there's a campus getting $6 million in state appropriation, and we run it through the model, and it tells us that they should only be getting $4 million. It's not realistic for us to go into a small campus and say we're going to pull out, 30% of your state appropriation, or however, whatever that number might be. So we quickly established that what we wanted to do was we want to take what the model suggests the state appropriation be for a campus versus what it actually is. We would come up with a ratio when we did that. I'll show you that in just a second. And then we would, as new state dollars came in, we would focus on those that were underfunded the most, and then we would lift them up. So if you were a campus that was, for purposes of this conversation, was overfunded, at least in relation to other campuses, you might be waiting several years before you actually received new state appropriation. Some of that will depend. Some of that will depend on who those campuses are that are underfunded the most. So imagine, I'll use the G example because it's the easiest for me to do. Always worried about doing math in public. So that campus right there, let's pretend that we went through this model and it determines that their state appropriation should be $100 million a year, but it's actually only $50 million a year. So we plot that out and we put them at the 50%. They're receiving 50% of what the recommended level is. And then we'll do that for each of the 7 campuses. And so imagine it comes out like this. And so you can see in this case that Campus D is by far the most underfunded campus here. So what we would do is as new state dollars came in, so imagine we get the legislature decides to give us $10 million in resources. The first $1 would go to Campus D until they got up to that same level. So that may be the entire state appropriation in a year. And you might imagine a scenario where if Campus D in that case was the University of Maine, for the University of Maine to move 6 percentage points up, is probably a lot more than if that D was Machias. And so some of how quickly we're able to implement this, how quickly we get to kind of what we refer to as parity across all the campuses, is going to, as you might imagine, pretty logical, is going to depend on how that works out. When we have the model, we plug in all the campuses, and we see where they end up. So in this case, we brought Campus D up. Now we've got 3 at 43%. If that took all of the state appropriation, then that may be all we do in 1 year. If it was just a portion of it, then we'll tackle campuses A, D, and F. We'll bring them up, and I can ruin the surprise. We just keep doing this until we get all of the campuses to what we refer to as equity. So we have no idea how long it's going to take for us to get there. We could anticipate some challenges. Again, imagine that we're in our current structure in Campus D. I forget the campus that started. Oh, Campus E, I guess it is. That started at 65%. Imagine that was Machias. You can imagine, and the 2 smallest campuses down there were the University of Maine and the University of Southern Maine. We could be setting up a scenario where Machias goes 5 years, 6 years without an increase in state appropriation. So there are certainly some challenges we'll have to talk about. Some of it will depend on how the campus mix is. But there was unanimous agreement in our group, as well as the trustees, that this was the most equitable way for us to get to equity without pulling other campuses down. I think that might be, we're all going to go up. So again, I think that walks us kind of through where we're going to go over the next several months. Again, just want to emphasize that we're going to put these teams together. We're going to develop some implementation plans. We plan on sharing those. We strongly encourage folks that are interested in having more conversations, weighing in on you know, the different components of the model. You know, we took a lot of feedback on that last fall. As we enter this next step, I think we're hoping for the same kind of feedback. We know how the South Carolina handled this. We've got 7 CBOs that have been talking about this for a while, but we're definitely going to want others' inputs, especially when we start getting into the details of those, you know, 6 components that make up the model. We will, you know, again, look for more information. I'm happy to come out give us a little while to get started, anyway, a few weeks to get started. But I would anticipate within the next 3 or 4 weeks, we'll start developing action plans for some of these. We'll start setting up forums where we can reach out to folks to get kind of the feedback that we're looking for. And again, we encourage folks to participate in that. And you know, huge thanks for coming out today.